So you need to assign permissions to more than one user. Stick around to learn how ACL-based permissions can accomplish this task.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for tuning in to more of the LPIC 1 Linux Administrator. We're going to be talking about ACL-based file permissions. Don, what are some of the goals for this episode?
Well, our first task is going to be learning the difference between access control lists and standard POSIX-based file permissions. Then we're going to see how to view the permissions, enable or ensure they're even enabled on our system, as well as modify and set those permissions to achieve our company's goals.
You know, Don, in another episode we talked about POSIX-based permissions. Now, those are basic permissions. What kind of limitations do they have? What do they set for us?
Sure. The biggest limitation that we have with POSIX-based file permissions is that they support one owner or user, one group, and then everybody else, right? Well, that model worked okay back in the 1970s when most computers weren't networked, so only one person was logged in at a time, individual file ownership was pretty standard, and you didn't have many groups. But in today's world, where everyone's computer is networked, where you have thousands of users in your company, that model falls apart. Because what if I want to have two different groups with permission to the same folder? Well, with regular POSIX permissions, you can't do that. What I have to do is create a third group, put the first two groups in the third group, and then assign permissions to that third group. You have to start doing nested groups, which is a little bit complex, right? And if you want to do more than one user, there isn't a way to do that. You just have to put those users into a group and use the group system to handle it. So POSIX permissions weren't designed to scale very large. And that's where access control lists come in. ACLs allow you to make a list of users, a list of groups that all have potentially different permissions. That's the other thing POSIX won't let us do. If I have two groups and I put them in one nested group, they're going to get one set of permissions. I can't say the sales team gets read, the marketing team gets read and write. Can't do that with POSIX-based permissions. But with ACLs, we can. We build that list out. We specifically state the sales team gets read, the marketing team gets read and write, and it's all tracked right there. But that wasn't originally included in Unix, and so as things migrated over into Linux and things progressed, this was bolted on after the fact. So that's a neat kind of upgrade to the previous system.
So Don, short of a motivational picture on the wall, how do we overcome these limitations?
All right, so the way we overcome them is by creating ACLs, right? Now you'll hear these referred to as access control lists or file access control lists, and there are some people who say ACL and FACL, which I personally hate, but you say it however you want to say it. But basically, we create these lists. Now, your step one is kind of what Wes was mentioning there, a diagram on the wall. You need to think about what are the permissions you want to assign. When I get to a particular folder, what do I want the sales team to have access to? What do I want the marketing team? Who do I want the owner to be? And is there going to be more than one user attached to this? You have to have a vision of what you want those permissions to be. And then you're able to go in and assign those permissions. Now, the POSIX permissions don't go away. They stay around. So whoever creates the file is going to become the owner, and whatever their primary group is going to become the group that's attached to it. And you may just leave it that way and then use ACLs for everything else and just never mess with ownership ever again, right? Or you might use that owner and group as the first thing that you set, the first user in the first group, and then everything else goes into an ACL. You need to figure out what your methodology is there. Personally, I usually let the creator be the owner in the group and then use ACLs for everything. And that way I only have to go look one place when I'm adjusting permissions. I just have to look at the ACL. So you have to have kind of a vision of what it is you want to do, and then you're ready to jump in and start to apply it.
All right, some of the things that we've seen, there are some things that are consistent across distributions, and sometimes they're not. When we talk about file system ACLs, are they consistent across distros?
They aren't.
Okay.
Well, so the tools that we use are consistent, and the syntax that we use, that is consistent. But whether ACLs are turned on or not is not consistent. So when you're on an Ubuntu machine or a Red Hat machine, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, or maybe I'm on a Gentoo or Arch Linux machine, odds are there's ACL support. It just might not be turned on, okay? ACL support is actually a function of mounting a partition. So when you mount a partition in Linux or mount a volume in Linux, the ACL option has to be turned on, okay? Now, usually you can see that in the file system table. So if I jump to my terminal here, I'm gonna cat my /etc/fstab. That's the file system table. And when I look in there, I can see where things like my root partition is mounted right here, right? So this one is just the slash. And if you look at the syntax here, I've got the file system, it's got the UID for it, and then the mount point, this is slash, and then the type, mine's ext4, and then the options, okay? ACL support is an option that needs to be turned on. You'll normally see it in here as ACL, ACL, comma, blah, 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 or other things, comma, ACL. Looking at mine, I don't see it. Mine just says errors equals remount dash RO. In other words, if it finds an error, remount it read only. It doesn't look like it supports ACLs. But here's where things get weird. In Ubuntu, it's actually the default. ACLs are turned on by default. So if I saw an entry here, it would usually mean that I was turning off ACL support, which most of us don't want to do. But not every distro is like that. So sometimes you'll see an ACL note there, sometimes you won't. If you don't see it, then what you might need to do is test to see if it's enabled. And there's a utility you can use called Tune2FS. This is a utility that allows you to modify ext partitions, right? So ext2, 3, 4, I know it's got a 2 in it, but the same tool works with 3 and 4. So see how I've got an ext4 partition? So I'm going to do Tune2FS -L. I just want to list information about a partition, and then I'm going to point it at my installation drive. Now, I could type the UUID, which is a lot, but I also see right here that it's /dev/SDA5. So I'm just going to point it to /dev/SDA5. And it's going to give me a bunch of options. Oops, it would if I sudoed it. You need to be an administrator, so I'll sudo it. Even though I'm not changing anything, you need to be an admin to see all this stuff. And in here, we can find the options. It actually gives me a lot of stuff, so let's grep that. I'm going to pipe that into grep, and I'm going to look for mount options like that. There we go. Here's the default mount options. And we can see user _XATTR, so it's tracking attributes, and then ACL right there. So that lets me know that ACLs are enabled. I can use them. It doesn't mean that I am using them. I might not be using them anywhere, but the support is there and it's turned on. So if you try and implement the stuff in this show and it doesn't work for you, there's a chance that the ACL option might not be turned on for your partition.
All right, Don, so let me give you a scenario here. Our viewers out there, they're sitting at their terminal much like you are right now, and they need to configure these file system ACLs. Can we see how you would do that?
Yeah. So there's some easy commands that we can use for this. So remember, their file system ACLs, or FACL. If you remember that part, the rest of it's pretty easy, because there's two main commands we're going to use. There's get FACL and set FACL, right? Get, like the name implies, lets us see the file permissions that are attached to a file. And the set is going to let us, well, set them, modify, change, whatever it is we want to do. So those two commands, if you can remember them, you've got ACLs under your belt. Now, I mentioned that you might not be using ACLs anywhere in your system. When I come in here and take a look, I'm going to do an ls-l to pull up the long listing of my home folder, right? And I look at these permissions. I can glance down that list, and right off the bat, I know I'm not using ACLs. Now, how did I know that? Okay, I know because if you use an ACL, regular POSIX permissions don't have a way to represent that, right? Remember, they're just read, write, execute. They've got the UGO, the user, the group, and other. That's it. They don't have a way to represent all the ACL stuff. So if an ACL is present, the last character, what would be the execute permission for everyone, will change to a plus sign. If you see a plus sign, not a T, but a plus sign, that lets you know that there's more permissions than what's shown on the screen. That's what the plus is supposed to indicate. So there's more stuff. And that means you need to use get FACL to be able to go in and see what those are. Okay, now none of mine have it right now, so let's set some to be able to see how that kind of works, right? So let's say that I've got a file. Let me get into my documents folder. All right, I've got that Dracula.txt file we've been messing with this whole series. I can see that I'm the owner, dpossessed, right? So I have access to it. I want to give Wes access to it. Not some group that Wes is in. I want to give Wes specifically access to it. Now, I could make him the owner. That would do it. But now I'm not the owner. I had to give that up. So I don't want to do that. I want to create an ACL that says I have access, and so does Wes, right? And so we're going to add that in. And I'm going to do that with set FACL. So set FACL if you're one of those people. So set FACL. So that's what I want to set. Now, remember that we had some syntax when we used the chmod command, right? Where we could say minus if we were removing permissions, we could do a plus sign if we were adding permissions, or equal if we wanted to override permissions. Well, with setFACL, it's kind of the same, except they're not those special characters. Instead, you have -m for modify, you have -s for replace. So this would be like the equal. And then you have -X for removing. All right. So it is different characters for this one. I kind of wish they would have done the plus minus equal so it would just be consistent, but they didn't, and they didn't ask me. So we have -M is the one we're going to use the most. We're just modifying permissions, -X to remove, and then -S to just straight up set and override whatever's there. All right. So I'll come in and just say I'm going to do a -M. I don't want to mess with the permissions I already have. I'm basically adding to it. And then I'm going to say U:, followed by a username. Right? In my case, this is going to be W. Brian. I want Wes to be able to have access to this. So U:, followed by the username. And then I need to do another colon and say what permissions I want him to have. Right? I want Wes to not only be able to read this, I want him to be able to write to it. So I'm going to do RW. If it was a program, I might do an X so that he could execute it as well, but I'm just going to leave it at RW. So this is the same syntax that we've seen elsewhere. And then I need to tell it what file I'm going to modify. I'm modifying Dracula.txt, so I'll put that there. So the full line is setfacl -M for modify, U:, W Brian, RW, so user Wes Brian, read and write access, and then the name of the file, Dracula.txt. When I run that, I shouldn't get any feedback. And now I can view those permissions and see if they worked by doing, well, let's start with an ls-l, right? So I'm going to pull my long listing and notice Dracula.txt. I lied a little bit. I said it was the last character that would turn into a plus. It's actually bumped it afterwards. So afterwards, I see that plus. But either way, right there at the end, that plus, it really stands out. I know there's something special about it. I see that DPZ is still the owner. I see DPZ is still the group. That hasn't changed. So visually, the screen hasn't changed much other than that plus. And if I do a get FACL of the Dracula.txt file, now I can see the owner is DPZ, the group is DPZ, and then I can see user permissions that fall after that. And right here, user : W Brian : RW dash. There's the user. I have more than one user attached to this same file, and that's what FACLs are all about.
Don, are the group permissions going to be handled the same way?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, we're usually going to use groups a heck of a lot more than users, so that's the one we're typically going to go to. And the syntax isn't that much different, right? So like, Wes, when I added you to this one, let's go back to my terminal here. When I added you to this file, I did a setfacl -M U: W Brian, permissions in the file. Well, we just changed that U to a G, and now we're talking about groups. And so I could say I want a group. So I'll say setfacl -M G: and we'll do marketing :RW on that Dracula.txt. And then I could even do it again and add somebody else. Like maybe I just want to give read access to the sales team. And so I can say setfacl -M. I want to modify. I don't want to overwrite what we had before, and set the sales team to get read access. And that's going to be on the Dracula file. And so now when I do a get FACL on Dracula, I can see I still have Wes. You're right there with read and write. But then a little bit further down, I can see sales and marketing. They've got that read and write access based on what I granted. All I'm doing is change that U to a G. So easy peasy lemon squeezy, as they say.
Don, we've been seeing this on files, right? On the Dracula file. How about directories? Does FACL work on directories as well?
It does, yeah. And it's actually the more powerful place to set it, because then that can inherit into new files that are created inside of a folder, so we can start to set up a real permission structure. Directories are a little bit different, though, in that how we modify them. Normally, like when you just go and set an FACL on a directory, it's not really a file ACL anymore. Now it's a directory ACL. But the syntax is basically the same. So I'm going to step back up here and take a look. I've got this books folder, right? And so I've got a number of books that are inside it. It's very exciting. And if we take that books folder, I want to change it to give the sales team access to that whole folder, right? Well, if I've already got files inside of it, they likely have their own permissions, so that's going to be a separate problem. But I can set it for the folder itself by basically bringing up that same command that we did, setfacl, and then I can say that I want to modify permissions, group sales. I'm going to give it read. But instead of pointing at a file, I'll point it at that books folder. And when I run it, I don't get any feedback. I don't get any errors or anything like that. If I do a get FACL on the books folder, I can see right there the sales group has permissions. Now, here's the thing. I just changed the permissions on the folder. That had no effect on the contents inside of it. And in fact, if I go inside of the books folder, and I'll just create a file, test1.txt, and do a get FACL on test1.txt and take a look at it, Notice how those permissions didn't inherit down. Sales doesn't have access to this, right? I've modified permissions on the directory itself. So with the directory, there's something a little bit more that we need to think about. And so I'm going to go back up to my home folder, and I'm going to pull up the line where I assign those permissions to the folder. So setfacl-m g:/sales:r./books. And I'm going to add something extra to it. I'm going to add a d:. All right. So it's setfacl-m d:/g:/sales:r and so on, right? By doing that, what I'm telling it is, hey, I'm going to set these sales permissions, and I want to make these the directory default, the default permissions found inside of there. When I run that, again, I don't get a lot of feedback. And if I do a get FACL on the books folder, though, look up here where I ran it the first time, right? When I pulled the FACL, the first 3 lines are commented out, right? And that's because these are just coming from the POSIX side. So on the ACL itself, there are really just 3 entries, and these actually came from the POSIX side too, right? A user, a group, and an other, and that's it. Well, now that I've set a default, when I run that, I see a lot more. Okay, here's the things that I expected to see, the 3 commented out lines, the sales group that we added, and so on. But now I've got all of these default lines that show up right here. A default user, default group sales, right? This is now my directory default. And this can be inherited by new files created inside of the directory. That's what that d: did. And at the same time, it created this entry here, a mask. Now, what is a mask? The mask, notice there's a mask here and there's a default mask. The mask is setting the maximum permissions that somebody can have inside of this folder. If I change the mask to be an R, no matter what permissions I give to Wes, he will only get read. If I give him read, write, execute, he'll only get read because the mask is only allowing that. So when we set a default on a directory like this, it's also defining that mask, and it's a lot more powerful. Now it's taking effect and managing the things that are inside of it, and it gives us more hierarchical control of what's happening inside of the folder.
Now, Don, you've been mentioning the permission inheritance. Can we see that in action? How does that work?
Yeah, so we've assigned a default now, and so as we go in and start to create things inside of the folder, it should automatically just grab that default, right? So let's see that. So I'm going to go into my books folder. So now I'm in the folder that has that default set, and I'm going to create a file. So I think I created test1 earlier, so I'll create test2.txt. I'm just using the touch command to create it, right? Now, normally with POSIX, it would say, all right, I'm dpossessed, right? So that's going to be the user, the owner. And then I'm in the group dpossessed. That's my primary, so that'll be the group, and then everyone else. And they'll get permissions that are based on the UMask that comes from the system. So that all happens as part of POSIX. But now the ACL kicks in as well. And so if I do a get FACL of test2.txt, and I take a look at that, it looks a little bit weirder, right? In that, yeah, the POSIX stuff still worked. The owner and the group are depossessed, so that's all normal like we expect. But I can see the group shows as having an effective RW-, even though the group might be assigned RWX, that's coming from the mask that was set. And I can see the group sales got read-only access, again, coming from the default. So I didn't have to come and assign a group onto this. It inherited it from the ACL. And that's really where the power is. But remember, it only applies to new files being created. Our existing files that are already in here, so I think we haven't touched 20,000 leagues at all this whole episode. So if I do a get FACL on that one and take a look at it, the default didn't apply here because the file pre-existed, right? Or if I move a file in, it won't apply. So it's just new things that get created in this folder.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's ACL-based file permissions. Don, what are some of the key takeaways that our viewers should be aware of for this episode?
All right, in this episode, we got a chance to learn what access control lists were and how they were better than POSIX-based configuration. I shouldn't say better because they are a little more complex. We learned about the set FACL and get FACL commands, which were critical to how we manage and modify ACLs. We also learned about how to apply this to a directory and even set defaults on the directory that then apply to files that are newly created inside of them.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's all for this episode, but we got a lot more exciting content coming up in the LPIC 1 Linux Administrator, so stay tuned.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.